and welcome back. I'm Ryan.
Hey, and I'm Brian.
And this is the Bible Bistro.
Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro.
Oh my gosh.
What?
My mind.
Twinsies.
I'm blown.
You know, this is a podcast all about the Bible, theology, and things pertaining to the Christian faith. That's what you say, anyway.
I don't say the word pertaining.
What do you say?
I say relating to the Christian
Relating
life.
to.
Or I think it's relating. Something along the... Every time you say pertaining, it messes me up.
You don't like pertaining?
It's a fine word. It's just not a word that I say very often. I mean, how often do you say the word pertain?
Apparently more than you.
More than once. Anyway, well, welcome back to the Bistro.
Here we are.
We're
in the same room. We're in the Bistro West.
Bistro West, which is the home, which is we need to give a shout out here.
Yes, the Broadleaf
Video Productions.
Yeah.
Video production.
Many thanks to the owner and CEO and CFO and COO of Broadleaf Productions.
Same person.
Yeah, well.
It's my brother, Scott, so we're going to give him a shout out. Scott Sarver there.
And if you need any video done in the Central Illinois area.
Yes, give him a shout out. Broadleaf Video Production. Now, if you're in Indiana, you got to call me. But in Illinois, call Broadleaf Video Production. So
right there, it cuts off in Danville. Is that it?
Cuts off, and once you get to Danville on the east side, nope, you gotta go to Indiana. But anyway, I want to big shout out for him because he helps us with this. We're using his cameras. We're in a studio and the lights.
Yeah, it's very nice. So. Nice lighting in here. Yes. There's water, free water.
Water. If that's what it takes to impress Brian is water.
You know.
Anyway, well, we're back here in the Bistro again. Yeah. We've talked about last week. What did we talk about?
We talked about Isaiah,
Hezekiah,
chapter 36 and 37. Hezekiah's prayer,
trusting in God. You know, and that when things look bleak, don't trust in ourselves, but trust in God. And we're getting ready to jump into something a little different.
Yeah, First Peter. So I said then that I was thinking about First Peter, and it occurred to me the other day. It's one of those things. You know how Facebook, if you're a Facebook person, from time to time memories come up, and it's always interesting. You know, that's one of the things I like about it. Actually, is those memories that come up, and there was just a statement I made about the first part of the book of First Peter. I'll say this: it occurred to me we haven't talked about First and Second Peter at all, and it's one of my favorite couple of books in the New Testament. You know, of course, John, but we've not talked about First and Second Peter much at all.
We have not. I don't think at all.
I think maybe one time we talked about it in relation to something else. I think we used First Peter chapter 3, but anyway, the whole thing about First Peter. And so the memory that popped up was basically I was talking about. There's kind of the very beginning of the book of First Peter has this really interesting juxtaposition of these two words. These two words side by side that are kind of seemingly contradictory, but they're all about who God's people are. And Peter, I think Peter in the whole book of First Peter makes a big deal about identity and names. I mean, here's a guy who Jesus named, right? His name before had been Simon, and identified him in a particular way. It'd be interesting to think about that sometime, but probably named after one of the Maccabean kings. And so he had these ideas, but then Jesus came along and said, "You're Peter." And this is after he made this pronouncement that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And so his name's changed. He's no longer Simon, but now he's Cephas or Peter. And interestingly, later in the book of First Peter, he goes through this whole big thing about rock and that kind of stuff. But at the very beginning of the book, he makes this phrase about who we are in God as God's people. And so it made me think about identity.
That's a big word.
It is. And I think we talk
especially
about
today
a lot today, right? And people talk about creating identities. They talk about who they are, and is this something that I have control over? Is this something that's my right in order to determine my identity?
It's a lot of it. Is it an internal thing, or is it something external that maybe exists outside me?
So how do you identify yourself? Like what are some ways that we identify ourselves, would you say?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. Like someone asked, like,
I know it's an interesting question. That's why I asked it.
Oh boy. Oh boy, it's going to be thick in here today.
Oh.
Anyway,
I'm just waiting. I'm waiting on
about like, who am I? You know what I mean? Like,
no. What categories do you use to describe your identity?
Father, like my relationships, you know what I mean? Like
so relationships is one way.
Husband, son, I talk about children, you know what I mean? Like father, I talk about, where I live, employment.
So geographical location, let's go back to that. So you talked about relationships. So family relationships.
Mm-hmm.
We can talk about geography is a different category, I would say, in some ways. So I don't live in Indiana, but I call myself a Hoosier. That's one of the ways I identify myself. Or even in a broader case, we might identify ourselves by nationality. Like if we're traveling someplace, we might say, well, I'm an American citizen, or I'm...
They usually know that I am by my volume.
And your size, you said.
Yeah, here's a funny story real quick. I've been to Cambodia.
Yeah. And people in Cambodia are not known to be in the NBA, for example.
No,
right?
Nor am I, just to be fair.
But they're not known for their height.
They're not known for the height. And when I'm there, I'm easily seen and noticed. I was in a shopping area once when I was in Cambodia, and this little girl, I would say she was probably 9 years old, was like kind of taking a nap in like her mom's stall. And I walked by and her eyes were like kind of blinking, and she opened her eyes, like these huge eyes, and pointed at me. Didn't say a word to anyone, just pointed at me as I walked by, like Godzilla has entered the chat.
Look at that.
Look at that. She'd never seen anything like that.
Well, and tell me, you said there were some Buddhist monks?
Buddhist monks, yeah. Everybody wants to hear this. I know. There's some Buddhist monks. We went to a Buddhist monastery, and I was talking to someone, and I had my back turned, and these monks are just everywhere, and they're up, like they're about 5 feet behind me, and I hear this like laughing, giggling, and they're like trying to come up like back to me to see how much taller I am than them. And so like then they requested like to have their picture taken with me, and I'm like, anyway.
Yeah, interesting. So identity.
Yes, I'm a large American, and when I'm in a foreign country, Ukraine, I was identified by my volume.
So you can identify. So this actually pertains to our. There I am. Pertains to our conversation.
The language bingo card.
Talking about our identity, because you can identify yourself by your looks too, right?
Devilishly handsome.
I'm a big guy. I'm handsome. I'm ugly. Whatever words we want to use. But you know what I'm saying? We would describe ourselves by our looks. We could identify ourselves in that way as well.
Mm-hmm.
What else? What else do you think?
I mean, people identify this as by the employment.
Yeah.
I'm this, I'm a that.
Yeah, or even qualifications like, either I'm a professor, I'm a pastor, I'm a videographer, or even by profession, like I'm an RN, I have or I'm a lawyer, I have the JD, I'm a member of the bar. So there's lots of ways we can identify ourselves, but
or by faith affiliation, like.
Yeah, that's true. I hadn't thought of that. You're a particular kind of Christian, or
not Christian,
not Christian, right? Or non-identifying. But so there's different ways to identify ourselves. So here's the interesting thing: most of those, though, are, we take a certain amount of pride in those, perhaps, or they're positive. Very seldom do we identify ourselves in negative ways. I'm an ex-con or whatever, but we tend to think about ourselves in these positive ways. But here's the interesting thing about the way First Peter begins. And so let me read just a little bit of this. So we've talked about this before with letters. You have a sender, recipient, and then a greeting, typically in the beginning of letters. And here's how 1 Peter 1 starts. Verse 1, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. So that's the way he identifies himself. But here's the thing I was talking about. To God's elect exiles scattered throughout the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. So these places who have been chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father. So the thing I keyed in on in this memory that came up on Facebook was those first two words, God's elect exiles. And isn't that interesting that side by side, chosen, that word elect has to do with choosing. But then this idea of exile is not normally one that has a positive connotation.
It's exclusionary.
It has to do with being an outsider, right? And Peter keeps up with that. He uses this kind of language in other places in this book. Let me go ahead and finish. Verse 2 says, "For who have been chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father through the sanctifying work of the Spirit to be obedient to Jesus Christ and sprinkled with his blood. Grace and peace be yours in abundance." So there's a Trinitarian formula here, like we often see: God the Father, sanctifying work of the Spirit, obedience to Jesus Christ, sprinkled with his blood, so that we're identified in relationship, we could say, to the Trinity, to the through persons of the Trinity. We've been sanctified. But here's the idea: chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father. You said you wanted to talk about that a little bit more.
I think sometimes that can be a sticking point, and we have talked about this, but I think
Ephesians 1, we talked about foreknowledge a little bit. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think just understanding, making sure we understand the election and foreknowledge piece of this.
Yeah. So God's chosen and chosen according to his foreknowledge. This is the idea that God knew ahead of time those who would come to him, right? And this kind of an idea. Some people see this choosing, we use the term sometimes double predestination, even that they're choosing this person. God is choosing this person to be his and this person not to be his, so to speak. And we don't understand it that way. What I think is being emphasized when it talks about his foreknowledge is this is a kind of choosing that we can count on, we can rely upon. This is something that has been set and is something that is known, so to speak. I don't think it has to do with us being marked out as much as it is that, again, you see it connected here to the sanctifying work of the Spirit and this idea of being sprinkled by the blood of Jesus. The idea that we are those who are set apart because of what God has done in his work, and then I would say our response to it as well. Our obedience to Jesus Christ here is mentioned, being sprinkled with his blood. So Peter, I would understand this to be writing to people who were followers of Jesus, who had come to know God through their response to what Christ has done. Foreknowledge, I think, emphasizes again the sureness or the certainty with which we can have confidence.
And the chosen piece of this is God's, through his foreknowledge, choosing
those who would come to him. I would say those who would respond to the saving work of Jesus is the way I would understand this. And I know it's a controversial statement, right? There
no controversy in those verses.
Well, let's talk. But this idea of chosen exiles or elect exiles, a beautiful title. I think this is kind of my response to it, because I think it describes where we find ourselves in our lives. It describes this idea of being chosen, but at the same time also being exile. This word, I want to look at a couple of other places where this word occurs, because it's only a few times in the whole New Testament we find it. Another place is in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11. And here Peter uses it with a different word. He adds another word to it. So as we get into kind of the body of the letter here in 1 Peter, he says, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles." Okay, so there's that idea of exile. Exile is kind of the idea you're in a place you don't belong, right? So I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires, which wage war against your soul. And he says, live such good lives among the pagans, that they may accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. So this connection, I think, with living among people who are not followers of Christ, living among, as he calls them here, the pagans. And so we find ourselves in an interesting position where we are chosen by God, but we find ourselves in a position of being foreigners or exiles. And I think this is where God's people find ourselves frequently. We find ourselves in this kind of a situation. And I think in just a minute, we're going to see where this leads in a topic that we've talked about previously, even though we've not talked about this one or this book. I think it relates to something we talk about frequently on this podcast. Go ahead and read Hebrews 11. Do you have it there or not?
I can pull it up.
Hebrews 11 is this faith chapter. Verse 13 is what I want you to read for me. Okay. Because that's the other use. This word's only used 3 times, twice in 1 Peter and then the other time in Hebrews. Hebrews 11, you remember, is this faith chapter where we have this entire listing of God's people from the Old Testament. And it talks about their faith. Abraham responded in faith, Sarah responded in faith. We sometimes call it the roll call of faith. All of these people who responded to God's call in faithful ways. And here's what the Hebrew writer often emphasizes for us, that they did this even when they could not yet see the outcome. That's the faith part of it, right? Because going to quote Hebrews, faith is being certain of what we do not see, right? Sure of what we hope for, certain of what we do not see. So read verse 13 here for me.
All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth.
Strangers, here's the word that's used. So it's that idea of exile again. So you see I'm saying? Faith, they accepted these things by faith. Even when they died, they had not yet received them. So we find ourselves here as strangers on the earth in a way. We're in an uncomfortable position where we find ourselves in exile. Because what is it like to be a stranger? I lived in, you talking about being in Cambodia and you stuck out like a sore thumb.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
I can remember living in a foreign culture, and there's always this, and I've talked to other people who've had this experience, there's always a kind of an underlying tension. As comfortable and as familiar as you become with the place where you're living, there's still always this kind of sense, I don't always exactly understand what's going on. There's an undercurrent here that I can't quite grasp because I'm not from here.
You're right.
I have a different experience. And that's what I think it is to be a follower of Jesus in the world in which we live. And I want to come back to this in just a minute, because I think there are different ways we can think of that and respond to that. But there's a way in which we're strangers and aliens in this place. One more passage, and this is in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 13 and 14, where he uses, at the very close of this book, a similar kind of idea. He closes by saying, she who is in Babylon. Okay, so he's picking up on Old Testament ideas here. Of course, Peter, again, he uses Old Testament a lot. He used it in the day of Pentecost in his sermon. This way he thought. He was raised in this kind of thought world. And so when he talks about the one who is in Babylon, we think about the idea, I don't say that correctly, right? Do you want to say it for me?
Babylon. You're
okay,
saying Babylon.
Babylon, because I'm a foreigner in Central Illinois. The way my people say it here is Babylon.
Babylon. I'm just Babylon Brooks.
But anyway, Babylon. This idea of being in exile, right? And that's the whole picture. Is that this is where God's people were taken into captivity. Mm-hmm. They were brought from their land. So tell me the stories. You're thinking about Daniel, right? Mm-hmm. And his friends. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, them being in this foreign context, and hey, eat these things that the king wants you to eat.
Yep.
No,
nope.
This is not what we do. Bow your knee to the
worship.
And all of these different pressures that were put upon them in order to conform to the nation they found themselves in. And so here's this idea, she who's in Babylon, chosen together with you. So here we're thinking probably the church or the followers of Christ in that place, together with you, send you her greetings. And so does my son Mark, greet one another with a kiss of love. So again, that same kind of an idea of chosen exiles. What a beautiful concept. That even though we find ourselves in these tense, difficult situations, we are still chosen by God, mm-hmm. and we are His people. And so that's really kind of the idea that I was playing with in regard to this. When we think about our identity, there's a way in which we're always going to be, to a certain extent, outsiders. Right. Mm-hmm. There's an extent in which we're going to be like in Babylon. We're going to be called to respond to things in a different kind of way than those around us. Yeah. And so it's always going to be a time of tension.
Yeah, that's I think that's one of the things that we forget sometimes.
Right.
I think in the past, I'm not saying now, I don't want to juxtapose and create something about our now.
Yeah.
But cultural community used to be much more culturally Christian,
sure. Right.
and seemed to be more in line with some of the values that those who were Christians kind of aligned with. But I think we're seeing now some of these ideas kind of start to, it's for us to be, to us to be different is right. Very different and exposing to us.
I think about my own congregation, who are Mennonite Amish when they came, very much a segmented part of the society. They relied upon each other for farm ground, for work, for helping one another, and those kind of things. They spoke a different language. Many exiles, when they first come, or I should say foreigners, when they come to this place, speak a language that's different than the predominant language. They have customs that are different than the predominant language. And so I guess that's kind of what I wanted us to think about today is how do we live that out? Now, you said in the past, I think we have to be careful here because we can fall into this trap of almost seeing ourselves at
romanticize the past.
We can romanticize the past. The other thing I was going to say is this kind of idea of being at war with the predominant culture around us. Mm-hmm. Now again, there are ways in which we can't adapt. I think we have to be careful in adapting to the dominant culture around us. But how do we live this out of being God's chosen people within a culture that we recognize that we're not in the predominant culture? How do we live that out? What does it look like, and what's the tension that we face in that? That's kind of what I thought we would talk about today.
And I think that's always, again, I keep talking about Revelation, but those first 3 chapters, the churches, is kind of going, how do you live in those contexts? In some ways, like they weren't exiled. They'd kind of thrown their hat in with Rome. With Rome, they were not exiles. They'd placed themselves,
and that was the warning, right? That you have accommodated yourself in some ways. Since you mentioned that, go ahead and read Revelation 2:17 for me. This is one I was thinking about here in relations when we think about identity and how we're known and how we call ourselves and this kind of thing.
Oh gosh, let me pull it up here too. I can't type. Okay, here we go. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who is victorious, I'll give some of the hidden manna. I will also give that person a white stone with a new name written on it, known only to the one who receives it.
So that idea of the new name it has to do, I think, with this idea of being identified in a way that can't be taken, can't be stolen from you in a way, a name known only to you, identity that only you have, that's unique. But here's where we're going back to this idea of identity. Is identity, and this is where I think in our culture we have to ask this question in our time, is identity something that we create ourselves, or is it something we receive? Is it something that is given to us? And I think I'm going to argue for a follower of Christ, it's something that we receive.
Right.
This stone with a new name is given. Right. It's not something that we create ourselves. It's not something that we come up with on our own, but it is something that Christ gives. And you're talking about the foreknowledge and the choosing. Mm-hmm. I think our identity as God's people come from Him. One more passage, and this is Revelation 14, and you'll remember this. This is where he talks about those that have been set apart. And we talked about Revelation 14 in some length at a different episode here. But he said, I saw 144,000 with his name, the Lamb, and his Father's name written on their foreheads. And I talked then about this kind of idea that it's being identified, by their name, having, it's almost like a name tag or the name in a book. It's being identified as God's, belonging to Him and being identified by Him is kind of the idea I think that we have here in this place. And so again, it's a name that's been given to us. It's a name that we're identified, not something we're creating ourselves, but something that is given to us.
Yeah, and I think if we're going to be exiles, that there's the connotation that there is a place that is home. There is a place that is foreigners.
Right.
If you're a foreigner, that means there is a place that is home.
Right. And what is that? It calls to mind a couple of different things. How do we understand that typically? What's this other place that we're looking for? In the past, we might have talked about in the sweet by and by, or this idea that this place is not my home. I'm just a passing through, right? Mm-hmm. My something is somewhere beyond the blue. I can't remember that. We'll have people write in and tell us what I missed there. And somebody's going to joke about my inability to remember lyrics, but the this idea that that we're going to this other place, but is it that, or is it that this place has become different than what it was intended to be? In other words, this world, and I believe in God's plan to restore his creation and us to be a part in that. And so what has, again, it's kind of a funny way to think about it, but it's not necessarily we're talking about another place, but we're talking about that we are no longer in this isn't our home in the sense that it has become fallen, it has become corrupted and different than what it was intended to be. And so we find ourselves at odds with,
isn't that some of John's language as well? When he says like the world, he's referring to things that are sinful and corrupted.
But he said, but Jesus says, I am not taking you out of the world. Right. And so
that's the definition of I'm placing you as a foreigner in this world, this sinful place.
So part of what it becomes, and I asked you to read a book several years ago. It's one that I used to read a lot in connection with First Peter and have students read in connection with First Peter by Will Willimon and Stanley Hauerwas, called Resident Aliens. I think it's an excellent book. It's a book that is challenging. It's a book that we're not.
It's like a poem.
Okay.
I mean, it's not a poem, but I mean, like there's
beautiful language to it.
I just said, like, when we talked about it, I'm like, there's some squishiness to this book. I think I said, or.
And there are some things we may disagree with it, but here's the thing I like about it so much is it kind of examines what does it look like when God's people live in a different way. How do we live in a way? I didn't say this earlier when I was talking about the congregation that I serve right now, but they used to have this phrase that they were a peculiar people. And that comes from this passage in First Peter. It's recognizing that we are a different kind of people. And so the early Amish and the Mennonites dressed differently and identified themselves by not adapting to the current fashion. We're gonna dress in older ways, and again, I'm not necessarily saying that's the case, but I do think we have to think about how we're going to engage in the dominant culture in which we find ourselves. Are we going to just go along with every fashion and every trend and everything's going to be fine, or is there a way in which we try to find our identity given to us in Christ, and we recognize ways in which we need to live that out? I think it's an important question for us.
Yeah, I think it's an important question, and I think I'm going to project here. I think it's sometimes hard for people to figure out how to answer for themselves.
Yeah.
And when I say that is we know I don't say we know that, but I think we have an idea of what it would look like for God's kingdom to reign here on earth, but kind of going, how do I live that out in my context?
Right.
I think that's hard for some people to in their day-to-day, like, working life, or what does that do? I've always thought to myself sometimes, like, man, I wish I could, or like you hear a story and you're like, man, I'd just give some money to that, or I'd jump into that. But it always seems like it's a story that's far away from me, or something that's far away from me, but kind of going, how do I make myself a foreigner in my context?
In that context, right? In the immediate context we find ourselves in. It just occurred to me there's another identity that we didn't use, and I think it speaks to what you're talking about, is we didn't talk about political identity. Oof. Well, and we're living in a divided time in the United States.
What?
And so we often will identify ourselves with one party or the other. And yet again, is the question, I said to someone this past week, is it an idea of us reading our faith through our political perspective, or is it that our political perspective is determined by and interpreted by our faith, which I would see that more. So when we ask, and that's why I think this is so important, when we ask this question of what it looks like in the way that we identify ourselves, are we living out our faith in a way that is a knee-jerk response because of some title we've accepted, or are we thinking through what is the faithful way to be a follower of Jesus, given this, like you said, our immediate context, this problem that's right in front of me. And we talk in these big terms a lot of times. We're worried about things that are going on. Right now, Jackson, Mississippi, there's this question about water, and we think about that. My wife's been very involved in the flooding in Eastern Kentucky. We think about these big things that happen far away. Dallas, Texas experiences flooding. But often I say the issue is, how do we think about the people who are right in front of us? How do we respond to the people who are right in front of us? And how are we living out our faith in connection with them?
Yeah, it's really, yeah. I mean, I feel like we live in a culture that wants to shove us. You know what I mean? Like, if this is you, then that, you know, if you made that choice, you're into that. If this is your choice, then into that. And I think it's, gosh, I'm kind of getting sick to my stomach even thinking about this conversation. Not that.
I get it.
But, you know, I think that is a really hard question. How do we live out our faith? Mm-hmm. You know, even in politics. And it's like, you know, I think this is my opinion. I'm just supposed that we want our political parties to do the work that the church is called to do.
I think that's true sometimes. I think you're exactly right.
And, you know, it's, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I think it's hard. You know, I think it's, we want to place ourselves in a group. I mean, I think there's always this group identity like that seems to be that everyone wants to place them in. But, you know, sometimes it, you know, as exiles, I think the whole point by saying exiles, we don't fit into any real group that's here.
I think that's right. And I'll go back to our previous conversation when what you're saying is, again, where do we place our trust? Are we looking for a political solution? And I'm thinking about when we talked about Isaiah.
Yeah.
Are we looking for a political solution, or are we trusting in God? And that, you know, that's where I think, again, we have to be different in this. Let me talk a little bit about, let's go back to 1 Peter 2 now. And again, we're still thinking about this idea of our identity and how we see ourselves identified as followers of Jesus. And I find this interesting. So Peter, again, uses all these Old Testament images and all these Old Testament metaphors to talk about this. Verse 9, he says, "But you are a chosen people." Now, there's our idea of choosing again, right? Mm-hmm. And we've talked before, it's not necessarily choosing of individuals, but we would understand this as choosing the people, right? Mm-hmm. You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. And this is a word that we find in the Old Testament several times. I'm going to look at one example of it in a minute. That you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. So again, I think the identity is given. Once you had not received mercy, he finishes, but now you receive mercy. Our identity is given. It's not something that we create ourselves. Chosen people, set apart, the idea of a holy nation, you know, holiness, we talked before about the idea of being set apart. And then we have these other images. So look at Exodus 19, because this is really what he's quoting here. Exodus 19, 3-6. This is the quotation that he begins with. And then he ends with an allusion here to the book of Hosea. Really interesting passage in Hosea. So go ahead. If you got Exodus 19 there, go ahead and read that.
Yeah. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites."
So there's, you know, some of that language that you see there again. This idea of treasured possession is a beautiful image. We see it here. We see it in Deuteronomy. We see it in the book of Malachi. That this is a word that God uses for his people. And I think about it in terms of, you know, we like our things pretty well, but what are our treasured possessions? What are those things that we say, this is what is special to me? You know, the way I've talked about it before is, if we were in a fire, what's the one thing that we would take out? And God here says to his people, that's what you are to me. So if identity has to do with relationship, like we said before, God's relationship with his people is what identifies us. The name written on our forehead, right? Mm-hmm. The way that he has chosen us, the way that he has identified us through Jesus, I think is a big part of our identity. He goes on there, you know, the holy nation language is there, and a kingdom of priests. And I always think it's worth stopping and thinking about that, because a priest has a job. You know, we talked about occupations, right? Mm-hmm. The priest's job is to be an intercessor between God and people. So in the temple, the priest's job was to, when a person came to sacrifices, they're the ones who led them through the steps of sacrifice. That they were the intermediary teachers, but also intermediaries between the people and God, the representatives that led the people through proper worship. And so I don't think we can emphasize this enough. Here is God's desire for his people, and this was his desire in the Old Testament, is that they would be an entire kingdom of priests. So the image here is that the other nations around you, I want you to be the intercessors between me and them. I want you to be the ones who are leading them to me, is the idea of the kingdom of priests. And this is what Peter says, then we have become. Peter uses other images I wish we had time to look at. Maybe we'll go through some of 1 Peter in another time. But, he talks to us about us being built together into this kind of house, and we have now become a holy nation and a kingdom of priests. We're identified in that particular way. Hosea chapter 1 then is where we get this idea. Formerly you were not a people, but now you've been made my people. So let me teach you a little Hebrew.
Oh boy.
So the word ami, is the word for people. And then whenever you have that I on the end of it, you see it all the time in place names and people's names and that kind of thing. That's a possessive. That's a first person possessive. So ami means my people. The E is the my.
Okay.
So is the word for people. And then ami means my people. So this is talking about the prophet Hosea. And he was commanded to marry this woman named Gomer. I'll let you write your own jokes there, but she has this child, and first he says you need to name the child Lo Ruhamah. Lo means no or not. If you look at the 10 commandments written in Hebrew, all the commands, first ones begin with no. Thou shalt not have any other gods before you. You shall not make it to be any grave name. All these no's, all these nots. So lo ruhamah means no mercy. That's what the child's name meant. I always felt sorry for this child, this probably female child at kindergarten. What's your name? No mercy is my name. But then Gomer had it says another son, lo ami, which means not my people. For you are not my people, and I'm not your God. So this is the message that God is giving through Hosea. But then he says, yet the Israelites will be like the sand on the seashore, which cannot be measured or counted. In that place where I said to them, you are not my people, they will be called children of the living God. So you see that change in identity from not my people, now you're going to be my people. The people of Judah and the people of Israel will come together, and they will appoint one leader and come out of the land out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. So say to your brothers, my people, and of your sisters, my loved one. So, whereas previously you were no mercy or not loved, now you're going to be loved. And formerly you were not my people, now you'll be my people. So that's what Peter's referring to when he uses this in 1 Peter chapter 2. Once you were not a people, you had no mercy, but now you are God's people who have mercy. Again, the identity is given, though. It's something that they have received. It's something that they've been given.
Yeah. So, I think that's, what does that mean for us then?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess that's the big question.
I think that it is. I think it's something that, like you said, we have to think about. And I think we live in a time where we're encouraged. And we've been reading a couple of books that talk about this quite a bit. We're living in a time, and at least one of the authors says from the time in the 1960s, where we have been encouraged to create our own identities. We don't, there's almost a separation, right, from relationship, from families, from any kind of group. Don't be defined by any kind of group. Don't be put into a category.
Because the group has these controlling things on it, like they're not allowing you to be your full self. And so like the group, if you're going to be in the group, there has to be some kind of control put on you.
And so self-expression is the emphasis. This particular author we're talking about, Charles Taylor, talks about authenticity, and that's a big
the
phrase.
Age of authenticity.
It's a big phrase for people, is this idea that I'm going to be my authentic self. Well, again, I use this phrase, but here's how I would say it is that we are created. We are the people that God created us to be, right? Now, we are fallen,
Sin has some hold on.
Sin has marred the image that God has, again, we are created in God's image. Sin has marred that image, but we are also redeemable in Christ through what he has done. So I would understand, and again, I mean, I get this desire, but I think what I would understand is God has given us this identity, and he has redeemed us, our images in Jesus. And so it has to do with this group. We are this chosen people. We are this holy nation, this set apart people, not to be defined. And this is the irony that I think maybe even Paul would talk about this in Romans. The irony is what we understand to be freedom is instead binding us. This idea of being free in our actions is actually what controls us, instead of thinking that we have some kind of freedom that we can express ourselves in any way that we choose. So
yeah, I think that's, Paul talked about that being a citizen of heaven, you know, like not of this place, right. And kind of going, what does that mean? I think that's really hard because we have this the culture wants to push on this, like, we need to be free and we need to evaluate what is this group. I mean, power is the flavor of the day. Like, what is this group? What's this power they're trying to put on us? And God's saying, like, I'm giving you this identity, and it is my power that is through you.
It reminds me of, you remember when we talked to Chad Ragsdale, and he was talking about that there's almost this tendency to say to people, to young people, you're completely without limits, you're completely free. And he says this is what leads to anxiety. This idea leads us to not be able to connect or to have identity. And so I think again, having identity in Jesus, created by God, redeemed by Jesus, is what we're really looking at. I think our identity is in him. And I think that's why I love that language, chosen exiles, right? It speaks to both parts of our experience. It speaks to that part of our experience where we say, I don't fit here. But at the same time, I'm loved. I have received mercy. I am his people, one of his people, and I have my identity in God. This is really, and the reason I think this is important is for some people, this is where I think, for some authors, this is where discipleship really begins. It begins with this idea of, recognizing who we are in Christ, recognizing our identity is in Christ, not in something we've created ourselves, not in something that we have to do, some kind of thing we have to earn, but it's recognizing who we are in Christ, I think is the key, and maybe the beginning of discipleship for us.
Yeah. So. And I think that's an important point, as we talked about, like the anxiety that comes from, like, am I being true to my, what I mean? Like, it's always this, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? Yeah. And Christ says, you are mine, you are mine, and you're my people. And this is what that means for you. And this is what it means for your life. And this is what means how you are to live out and to interpret the world around you. Right. And that, in some ways the world is, you are going to be in exile. You're going to feel different in the world. And that's, and feeling wrong, maybe wrong, is not wrong. That I think that's a discomfort. A discomfort is not wrong. You shouldn't be seeking comfort. Sure. You should understand that as a citizen of heaven, as a part of the kingdom of God, a priest to God, that in this world as it is now, you're going to feel like a foreigner in it.
So that's where I was going with this. Is I say, one of the things we talk about a lot on here is the theological term is eschatology. It's the idea of the end things, and everybody wants to know about Revelation and these kind of things, and this is really what I think we're getting at, is this idea that there's this recreation of the universe that's taking place, that we still see the effects of sin and brokenness, and that's what causes us discomfort. It's what causes us to question our identity in Christ at times, but I think even more we need to hold fast to it. you often talk about your kids and trying to raise them and to have an understanding of this, within the context they find themselves in. And there's so many messages, for our young ladies and the young men in our society, I think, about what they're supposed to be, or, what's supposed to be allowed and these kind of things. And I think it's a difficult time to try to raise our children in a way that their identities are firm in Christ.
Yeah. This reminds me of something, Brian Lowry.
Yeah.
So Dr. Bob Lowry, who was at Lincoln Christian Seminary.
And we've talked about him in connection with Revelation. Wrote a great book on Revelation, used to teach very frequently. We've quoted him on this podcast.
And his son, Brian Lowry, who now works at Lincoln Christian University. I don't know what it's.
Does he?
Yeah, he's back there now.
Oh, is he? Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, I remember back in my college days, I think Brian spoke at a chapel, and he was talking about his dad, and Brian was going out with some friends for the night, and the words that his father had said, I don't know why this stuck in my brain. He says, "Remember who you are and whose you are."
Yeah.
And Brian said, that stuck in his brain about, and I thought, whose you are, you know what I mean? Like recognizing his, remember who you are. You're Brian Lowry.
Yeah.
But then remember,
chosen.
You are whose you are. That you're chosen by God, in that chosen exile.
Yeah.
And how does that reflect in your life as you go out and live with his friends? So I don't know. I just thought of that as we get that. I think that's an interesting question for us to ask. Like in these situations in my life, whose am I?
Yeah. And how does that reflect?
Am I acting as my own?
Yeah.
Or am I acting as God's, chosen
beloved, treasured possession?
Yeah. Part of his. Awesome. Well, Brian, thanks so much.
Yeah. Hope that was helpful. And
this is a little different episode.
Yeah, we'll come back to 1 Peter at some point.
We're just chatting it up today. If you're enjoying the podcast, we didn't mention this at the beginning. If you're enjoying the podcast,
did we not? How could we not have mentioned this?
You just jumped right into it. If you're enjoying the podcast, we invite you to share or go to Apple Podcasts and write us a review. Or if you're feeling spendy, you can go, and by spendy I mean buy us a cup of coffee a month. You can go to our website or Patreon and sign up and get a coffee mug or a t-shirt or something like that. Great. So Brian, thanks so much.
Yeah, we're going to talk about Revelation maybe next time. Maybe the millennium.
Dun dun dun. Oh, no. 1,000 years. What's it going to be like? I don't know. All right. Thanks, Brian.
See you, man.
Bye.